Check the description for the following discount codes. Before we get into the meat of how this is to use for sim racing, just a quick update following on from my review from a few days ago. When I listed off the resolutions, Pico versus Quest 2 for use with virtual desktop, I took those resolutions perhaps 5 days before I published a video, and in that 5 days, Guy Godin, the developer of Virtual Desktop, has now updated Virtual Desktop so that both the Quest and the Pico resolutions do match as close as they can, because these have square panels, 2 of them, and the Quest of course doesn't. It has 1 rectangular panel. But yeah, so now Potato, Low, Medium, High and Ultra are all pretty much exactly the same resolution on both Pico and Quest. So should you flick from one to the other, you can choose your presets and they do marry up and your PC will perform the same. And he's added an extra one called Godlike for the Pico, which is that higher resolution, because the Pico does have a higher resolution panel. So just a little update there. He also suggested to me directly in the comments that I enable video buffering to try and get rid of some of the instability that I mentioned in my review. I was saying it's not as smooth as the Quest 2 for PC VR, and I was getting noticeable stutters and it wouldn't hold a solid FPS. Now I've enabled video buffering, and whilst it does make a difference, it's still not as smooth as a Quest 2, at least not in first-person shooters. I was testing it in Zero Caliber. It's not unusable or terrible, it's just not, and what else did I try? Half-Life Alyx. It's just not as smooth as a Quest 2, even with video buffering enabled. Now, video buffering does add a touch more latency. You know, the very nature of a buffer is that it loads something ahead of time, so that if, you know, there's an interruption in the data stream, there's a frame or 2 there ready to display, so you don't get a hiccup. So that does add a touch of latency, but you know, if you keep your other latencies as low as possible, and you want to keep all your latencies as low as possible anyway, then it's not really noticeable. You know, I was doing obviously some sim racing to test this out, and that's a good point actually. But before I go into this too much, we can't compare this headset to anything other than other wireless VR headsets. So Quest 1 and 2 and whatever else might be out there, because the image quality is always going to be compressed when sent to a wireless headset, whether you use it wirelessly or with a USB-C cable. The only headsets that don't use compression are ones that are fully hardwired and can't be used wirelessly, or like the Pico Neo 3 that has a display port on it. And obviously anything like that is going to be better image quality than what we use and what we see with wireless VR headsets like this and the 2 Quest variants. So, you know, when I go through this, don't think about things like the G2, because it isn't a fair comparison. That is a wired headset. So, yeah, let's talk about this then. So, all the sims I tried like the major sims that I'm most familiar with and that I've tried all my other VR headsets in, the likes of Assetto Corsa Competizione, Dirt Rally, Project Cars, the original AC. And to summarise it very briefly, if you're used to using a Quest 2 and you match the resolutions in, I did it wirelessly because first of all, the Pico streaming software is terrible at the moment, so using it wired is just a terrible option. It looks absolutely awful. It's really low resolution with bad audio. So I did it using Virtual Desktop, which is how I would use my Quest anyway, so a direct back-to-back comparison. If you're used to using a Quest and you run this at the same res, you essentially get the same performance. And this is the biggest problem with VR and sim racing. The bloody GPU and CPU horsepower required to hold a solid, you know, I actually had to drop to 72 hertz, 72 frames a second with this, because at 90, I had to turn down the in-game graphics or the render resolution so low to hold that 90 hertz that everything just looked awful. And even dropping back to 72 hertz, which gives you quite a bit more overhead as far as performance goes, it's a considerable drop from 90 to 72, must be close to 20%. I can still only run things on kind of medium settings in game, and I've got an RTX 3080 and a Ryzen 5 800X for reference, so decent PC. Yeah, sort of medium-ish settings, medium low, and the render resolution of the headset I had to run on medium also. I couldn't run it on godlike, which is what would give you a near native resolution render, which in a perfect world is what we would all want to do, you know. Just to briefly explain that, it would be a bit like having a 4K display and running it at, say, 1080p or 1440p. That's what we mean by render resolution. So if you don't run the highest possible render resolution, I'm not talking super sampling, I'm talking the correct render resolution to accommodate barrel distortion. If you can't run that, then you're running the screen, the displays, at a lower resolution, a bit like running a 4K screen at 1080p, for example. So me running medium in virtual desktop for the render resolution is literally that example, 4K down to like 1080p. So you can imagine at that res, it doesn't look anywhere near as crisp. There's jagged edges everywhere. And then you combine that with sort of medium in-game settings, no anti-aliasing. Everything just looks horrible, and this has nothing to do with the Pico. This is just how running VR is in sim racing. Titles, my Quest was exactly the same. The Pimax headsets, well, they were even worse because they had higher resolution even than what this is, you know, especially the 8KX. And of course the G2, and you know, you're just pushing so many pixels. The two panels in this are the equivalent to almost 3 4K displays if you actually do the pixel count, or perhaps 2.5 4K displays, and you're trying to run them at 90 hertz. So, like, I mean, I've got 3 4K displays literally there, my triple setup, and I run them at 1440p a panel because I can't run them at 4K with good in-game graphics and hold 60 FPS. Just the 3080 just can't do it. So what we've got here with this VR headset and the Quest and the Reverb G2 and anything remotely modern that's high res is that same scenario. And what's more important with VR is running high refresh rates. You want to run at the very least just 72 hertz. Ideally you want to run 90, especially for sim racing titles where, you know, response times and that are a bit more important than some other games like first person shooters. So that's what you've got to bear in mind. And I was, you know, I don't race sim racing VR really ever because I get horrible motion sickness, and I was reminded of that while I was testing this out, of course. But I do test out all my VR headsets in VR for sim racing, just because, you know, specifically to do, you know, to see how it looks as the sort of field of views get wider over time. And this has a slightly wider field of view than, say, the Quest 2, for example. And again, Quest 2 is a good comparator here. It's another wireless headset. It's what we should be comparing it to, not things like the G2 that are wired, for example. So the FOV for sim racing is still very much tunnel vision. You know, I'm used to sitting in those triple 55s, and I have 180 degree or just over peripheral vision. I see cars coming up beside me in the corner of my eye without having to turn my head. You know, it's like, oh, there's a car coming up there, there's a car coming up there. You can't do that with a VR headset. And I mean, the Pimax stuff, potentially you can see more, but you have to deal with, you know, distortion and all sorts. But with normal VR headsets that don't have a huge FOV, that was one of the things I noticed straight away. It's like, bloody hell, I forgot it's been a while since I've driven in VR, and instantly I'm like this, not being able to see my mirrors almost, or certainly not the passenger one, and not being able to see cars coming up beside me, and turning my head, you know, a lot to look left and right. I guess, yes, not the Pico exclusive issue, it's just VR versus huge triples, of course, and that argument can go on for ages. But what I was also reminded of is how nice it is to have proper three-dimensional depth perception in VR, you know, versus being sat in triples. What's really funny is, in spite of having to have the graphics looking, what I'm going to say is crap, because I had to turn the render resolution down and the in-game graphics down. Normally everything's running on ultra, fully anti-aliased, and now I'm back to bloody, you know, PlayStation 1 jagged edges everywhere to use VR. In spite of it looking a bit pants, I actually shaved about a quarter of a second off of a stage in Dirt Rally, and me and Katie have been going back to back on this stage trying to beat each other's times, and like I've been in the lead by like half a second for ages on this stage. In fact, there'll be clips of me driving in all these sims up throughout this video, so I might put that one up now. And like I've been on this only a week ago on this stage and had 4 or 5 runs trying to just edge away from Katie's time, and couldn't quite get any quicker. The very first go I had with this headset on today, and I took 1/4 of a second off the stage time, and I didn't even drive well, or at least I didn't feel like I was driving well. It was rough around the edges. I was missing my braking points because it was the first time I've been in VR like in months racing, certainly in Dirt Rally. And yet, because of that added depth perception and the proper feeling of spatial awareness, I guess that just made all the difference. And I took that extra 1/4 of a second off. It's quite, I was sort of sitting there chuckling to myself thinking, oh, well, that's impressive. But anyway, I'm getting a bit sidetracked here. This is VR versus triples. But as far as the headset goes, yes, apart from everything having to look a bit crap, because I've got to turn all the graphics down and the render resolution down, the experience is very similar to what you would get with a Quest 2, being wireless, but with the comfort and balance of this headset. So it obviously sits nicer on your head, which is good for long play sessions. And then with the improved clarity of the lenses, which of course allowed me to see my very poor graphical settings in even greater detail than what I did previously. In some ways, I'd rather a blurry headset, because then you've got some natural anti-aliasing of those jagged edges where you've had to turn your settings down, your render resolution and your in-game settings. But other than that, it was a really nice experience. From a VR point of view, it was comfortable on my head, excluding obviously the facial interface that obviously I have light leakage with, but that will be changed. And I've kind of got used to this back piece being as hard as it is. I mean, like in the middle here, it's literally rock hard. My thumb only goes in a couple of mil, and then I'm hard up against the plastic, what I'm assuming is the battery housing behind it. But you kind of get it tucked under the back of your head in just the right place, and you don't really notice it too much. It's okay. Still, could definitely still be better, but it's okay. So yeah, I had no problem sitting in the rig there for a good hour and a half, going through different sims, trying different cars and different stages and what have you. So the comfort was fine. I didn't sweat or overheat, which was nice. Not having all that weight on the front does make a big difference compared to most other VR headsets. And, and having that little bit of extra, field of view compared to I went back and forth with the Quest a little bit as well, just to remind myself, because instantly I felt like I was like this compared to my triples. So it wouldn't have been a fair comparison. So, there is a little bit more field of view compared to the Quest, and it is noticeable. But again, what's really noticeable is how clear the image is, compared to the Quest with those pancake lenses and that larger sweet spot on edge-to-edge clarity. So that was all good. I didn't have any noticeable latency issues at all, and I was using this wirelessly. Someone did comment about using, there's a hack whereby you can use like a USB-C cable as if you're wired, but with virtual desktop, and apparently that's a positive thing. From a latency point of view, that would remove the latency added by going over the air, over your Wi-Fi router. But I only have about 4 milliseconds of latency from using my router, because it's literally sat behind the center screen of my sim rig. And 4 milliseconds is nothing, unless, maybe you're at the very highest level of sim racing and you can tell the difference. But for me, it made no difference whatsoever. And as I say, I actually shaved 1/4 of a second off that stage in Dirt Rally, which was a real surprise. So latency over virtual desktop wirelessly, no issues whatsoever. Obviously, the wired connection is still utter dog poo. So until Pico update that, I can't recommend using it, because things look even worse. And when you're already in a scenario where you're having to turn your settings down because you're running VR, I mean, what it does is it lowers the render resolution to really, really low, which it must almost be the potato setting equivalent, actually thinking about it, if we're talking about virtual desktop. So yeah, and like I say, I had sound issues as well. I mean, it would keep it charged, or at least it would slow the rate of discharge, but I just don't like having cables these days. When you see my other review where I was downstairs in the front room using it, I'm turning around in all directions all the time. I'm kneeling down, I'm standing up. If I had a cable, I would have tripped over it, I would have yanked it out the headset. It'd be no use whatsoever. But even for sim racing, I just don't like something kind of You feel it pull on you. I know some people are going to disagree with me, but you do feel it pull on you. Until you've got a headset that doesn't have a wire, and you use that for a while and then go back to wire one, you instantly go, bloody hell, this is a pain in the arse. So it is really nice to use without the wire, and being as balanced and as light as it is, you know, it's probably, well, it's the best wireless VR headset I've used for sim racing. The G2 for me is still the most comfortable headset I've ever used, because that isn't heavy anyway, because it doesn't have a battery in it. And the facial interface and the strap just fitted my head perfectly. But yeah, so from a sim racing point of view, if you're already used to a wireless headset, again, we can't compare to a wired one, and you're happy with the compression that we get by streaming either over a USB-C cable or over the air, then this is definitely a nicer experience than the Quest 2 because of the improvements that this headset brings to the table, including weight and balance and clarity. Now, I mentioned in the previous review about the sort of frame drops and stuttering, and Guy Godin said enable video buffering. I tried that on and off in the sim racing titles today, and strangely for sim racing, I didn't notice the same stutters or potentially frame drops that I did when playing Half-Life Alyx or Zero Caliber. The sim racing titles seem to be smoother. And when I turned video buffering on, I didn't really notice any visual difference or feel any difference. Now, it may be it's because I already had the settings turned down low enough to get a solid, smooth frame rate, whereas with the first-person shooters, I was literally finding that fine balance between maximum visuals, you know, and a solid frame rate. Maybe I was a little bit too on the line there. Although, no, I wasn't, because I even tried those first-person shooters right down on the lowest render resolution, and still there was stutters, and the frame rate didn't look solid. Interesting. But with the sim racing titles, either I just didn't notice it because of the type of game it is, where we're flying down a rally stage or around a track. You know, you don't get like a pause, like a pause or it's not like when you have a graphics card and you turn the graphics up too much, you know, for what it can do. It's not smooth and it's jerky, and you know, it looks horrible. I didn't get any of that with the sim racing titles, with or without video buffering enabled. So I can't tell you why that is, but the experience is smooth and I have no issues with it. And if you're happy with, like I say, the Quest 2's performance for sim racing, but you want a more comfortable, well-balanced headset with clearer lenses to see all those jagged edges because your settings are on low, then I've got no problem recommending this for sim racing whatsoever. It connected load up every single sim I used absolutely fine with no issues. There was no latency issues, nice crisp clear image, comfortable headset, no noticeable stuttering or frame drops. It was all just absolutely fine. So perfectly good experience if that's how you like to race, you know, your sim titles. But yeah, I think that's probably everything covered. I still think it's a decent headset, and I think it's only going to get better as we get more firmware and software updates and they iron out and tweak a few things, because they are still new to the game. One thing actually I have noticed, having only been using it for a few hours, I've noticed my camera's on the wrong setting for me to be able to hold this and it focus, so I don't know whether you'll see it, but I've got some light scuffing already. Will it focus if I get my head out of the way? There we go. Some black scuffing already, and I look after things, like I don't just throw stuff around. Some scuff marks on there that won't just come off with a bit of, you know, finger rubbing, and the same on this tracking. Let's try and cover my face. On the tracking sort of arch there. Now my Quest has absolutely, we've got two Quests here. They have no mark. There's another mark here. In fact, they have no marks on them whatsoever. So I'm thinking, again, this is probably a little bit indicative of the slightly cheaper plastics used versus what there is with the likes of the Quest 2. Because, you know, I mentioned before the sort of creaking and cracking of these controllers where the seams are, and how the buttons and that feel a little bit cheaper quality than, say, the Quest or some other headset. So I think these sort of scuff marks, and this is only sat on my desk here or on the sofa up here or on the sofa downstairs. It's literally been in those 3 locations because the charger's there on my desk. So I set it on the desk, charge it up. So it'll be interesting to see how many black scuff marks this has in 6 months' time, because like I say, I haven't smacked the controls against the wall or anything. I've no idea how this little scuff mark's got on there, you know, or on the top of the headset there either. In fact, there's a little bit underneath as well. So it does seem to be, oh yeah, and on the back of on the corner there of the battery. So it does seem to be marking a bit easier. But again, like I say, maybe that's just indicative of slightly cheaper materials. They don't feel bad, like, you know, like some other things I've reviewed where I've gone, oh my God, this feels so cheap. They feel fine. It's only when you do like you hold the Quest and you hold this, you go, actually, yeah, there's a difference in the materials. Anyway, I'm waffling on about things that aren't really that important to sim racing. So yes, sim racing headset, yes, absolutely fine if you are someone that's already happy using a wireless headset or one that uses a USB-C connection to compress and send the image. If you're not, and you're used to something like a G2 or any other properly wired headset, then you may not be happy with the image quality. For me, I personally couldn't care less, because I have to turn everything down to medium and lower the render resolution, so it all looks bad anyway. So it really makes no difference to me. But, you know, that's going to be entirely up to you guys. Anyway, there will be a link in the description to this as and when they come back in stock, should you want to get one. As always, thank you very much for watching, and take it easy.